Hello, my dear listeners, in this pre-Christmas rush of last-minute tasks to be completed before the festive dinner, which presses itself forward with the quiet authority of an approaching tide. Kitchens rehearse abundance, streets glitter with borrowed light, and minds run ahead of bodies. I thought I would speak to you now, before the holidays close their doors behind us, since the idea for this lecture came to me almost uninvited, immediately after leaving the studio of my artist friend James Byrne, who runs the excellent and razor-sharp Blackbird podcast, accessible on YouTube and Spotify, and well worth your attention. James is an ever-inquiring spirit, attentive to the fault lines of contemporary thought, and uncommonly prepared to risk an answer where most are content to rehearse questions. We spoke only briefly, as men often do when time grows teeth, about Erasmus of Rotterdam, Martin Luther, and the strange alchemy by which friendship curdles into ideological enmity. In that room, still warm from microphones and arguments, I dared to say something that startled even me, that every one of us has their own Martin Luther, a friend once trusted, once admired, who later contradicted, wounded and departed, sometimes loudly, sometimes with a silence that bruises more deeply. That thought followed me home like a persistent wind. It pressed against memory and conscience alike. So, my dear friends, today's lecture becomes a meditation on great changes that arrive through small personal fractures, on a stab in the back that history later baptizes as a turning point, on a fall, or perhaps more accurately, a loss in the whirlwind of doctrine and certainty that hurts with the particular pain reserved for friendship undone. This loss resembles the mourning of love that finds its object still alive yet unreachable, still speaking yet in another language entirely. Erasmus and Luther knew that pain before it acquired monuments and textbooks. They felt it as men, as thinkers, as friends entangled by admiration and suspicion. What followed reshaped Europe, faith, and the modern mind, though it began with something painfully intimate, a change of view, a hardening of tone, a refusal to follow where the other led. Let us sit with that fracture together, here, before the bells and laughter arrive, and listen closely to what it still asks of us. Egg and Bird, Ink and Fire, lecture on Erasmus's legacy and Luther's revolt. Word moved before any of us learned to spell it. I watched it in the slow grind of tectonic plates that pretended to sleep while they rehearsed catastrophe. I watched it in the seasons as they traded garments, summer's loose shirt for autumn's coarse coat, winter's iron mail for spring's green mischief. I watched it in vegetation that altered its grammar according to rain and frost. I watched it in animals whose migrations resembled prayers traced across the sky. I watched it most in us, the most changeable species on earth, whose presence here required adaptation as a daily sacrament. A human view of the world, held at a given moment, lasted as briefly as a summer breeze, and it carried the same treacherous sweetness. It soothed and it slipped away. That perpetual shifting brought to mind Martin Luther and Erasmus of Rotterdam. Luther, in protest, or perhaps in despair, nailed his theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, and initiated one of the most momentous changes our Western civilization has ever endured. Yet that great change, for all its thunder, grew from a smaller personal change, an alteration in the way Luther began to see the man whose learning had helped make his own revolt intelligible. Erasmus, mentor in letters, rival in conscience, a friend in the only way scholars sometimes manage friendship, through ink, distance, and the dangerous intimacy of ideas. Wind that came at night out of the Capard spine and waltzed along the weather side of my portleash windows carried a whistling burden of consequences, while the radiator ticked with its small domestic impatience, as though iron itself had learned a syllable of time. I held in my hand a facsimile page from Erasmus's Novum Instrumentum, that 1516 Basel miracle in which Greek letters, so long caged behind monastery walls, and the jealous habits of specialists, walked out among ordinary eyes with the shy authority of Scripture returned to its own pulse. The paper smelled of dust and starch, and I thought of the human hand that first set those types in order, of Froben's presses thumping like a heart in the Rhine air, of Erasmus leaning forward with that scholar's posture that always resembles prayer and always risks resembling pride, and of a monk in Saxony who read this new philological gift as tinder. In my mind's ear I heard the wooden door at Wittenberg creak under hammer strokes, and I felt the peculiar ache that arrives when friendship becomes history, which then becomes a knife that generations inherit as if it were bread. In this hall among students and colleagues, Let us take up the relation between Erasmus of Rotterdam and Martin Luther, and let us keep a provocation in view, that those theses, nailed in 1517, functioned as an argument against Erasmus's framework, as if the Wittenberg door had served as a rebuttal to the Rotterdam study. The provocation carried a hard truth. Luther's revolt belonged to the same moral weather that Erasmus had already named, even as Luther's method and metaphysics drove a wedge into the very humanist temper that Erasmus had cultivated. A man can share a diagnosis and still ignite a civil war over the cure. When later tongues said that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched, the proverb carried the scent of guilt, and Erasmus himself answered with a wry correction. An egg, yes, though the bird that broke its shell looked stranger than his accusers wished to admit. Erasmus grew from a wound that early life never quite allowed to close. He entered the world in Rotterdam, carried the mark of irregular birth, and then, before adulthood had finished its apprenticeship, he lost both parents, which left him with an education, purchased by grief and guided by guardians who held money like a rosary that they fingered for their own comfort. From the brothers of the common life, he learned that piety could live in the discipline of letters, and that devotion might be practiced through attention to grammar, which sounds petty until you have watched a single mistranslated verb become a scaffold. That education gave him the taste for sources, for ad fontes, for the clean spring above the swamp, and it gave him a mistrust of systems that demand blood as their proof. He became a priest by pressure, a monk by circumstance, a scholar by vocation, and then something harder to name, a moral satirist whose laughter often served as a confession. His praise of folly laughed with a knife in its mouth. His Enchiridion offered a Christian discipline that had room for lay consciences. His editions and paraphrases moved through Europe like a quiet contagion of literacy. When he wrote, he carried an ethic, reform through persuasion, learning through patience, peace as a Christian duty that rulers kept treating as a peasant's luxury. Luther's childhood carried its own iron. Born in 1483, he rose from a miner's household and a culture where fear of judgment lived beside the smell of bread. His schooling trained him with severity, his university life trained him with ambition, his monastic life trained him with terror. A storm near Stottenheim drove him into vows, though a thunderclap never entirely explains a conversion. It reveals it. Inside the Augustinian house, he learned a version of the Christian drama in which the soul stands before an absolute God and discovers that effort, however sincere, yields only exhaustion. When he found Paul afresh through Romans and Galatians, he found a word that felt like rescue. Grace given, grace sovereign, grace that arrives as gift instead of wage. The spiritual physiology of the man shaped the theology. He required an external righteousness because the inner workshop felt filled with smoke. When indulgences began to be preached and sold as if salvation carried a tariff, the monk's conscience revolted, and his revolt took public form in those theses. Erasmus viewed the indulgent scandal with disdain, since he had already mocked soul trafficking and clerical greed in print, and he recognized in Luther a certain candour that Europe had long suppressed under polite scholastic quarrels. Yet Erasmus also sensed the danger in Luther's temperament. The humanist carried the habits of mediation. The monk carried the habits of verdict. Erasmus sought reform by turning the church toward learning, toward scriptural languages, toward pastoral decency. Luther sought reform by calling the entire house into question, and the question carried the threat of collapse. Between them stood the printing press, which had begun behaving like a second Pentecost, scattering words into every dialect and every tavern. Here the thesis door provocation earns its purchase. Luther's 95 theses addressed indulgences, penance, papal authority, and the economy of salvation. Erasmus's framework addressed the moral health of Christian life through education, moderation, and the slow purification of institutions by learned critique. The theses did not read like a philological rebuttal to Erasmus, since they struck a narrower target, yet they placed their weight on a principle that Erasmus treated as perilous. That truth, once seen, deserved proclamation even when it set the world on fire. Erasmus feared the fire more than the dirt. Luther feared the dirt more than the fire. When fire began climbing beams, each man revealed his loyalties. Friendship unfolded through admiration and letters, which can carry tenderness while also carrying distance. They never shared a table as familiar companions, as far as the record runs. Their relation lived through texts, intermediaries, and the charged diplomacy of men who understood their own fame. Luther wrote Erasmus with reverence early on, since Erasmus represented European learning at its height, and Luther, for all his defiance, desired recognition from the Republic of Letters. Erasmus responded with caution, and with praise measured like medicine. In 1519 he advised Luther to aim his denunciations at abuses, instead of attacking the Pope as a person, counsel shaped by prudence and by his instinct for survival. Behind the courtesy lay strategy. Erasmus hoped Luther might become a reformer who remained inside the Church's walls, thereby sparing Europe the fracture that Erasmus already sensed as a coming plague. Then Europe forced a choice upon him. The early 1520s hardened the lines: excommunication, imperial diets, the spectacle of defiance, the gathering of camps. Erasmus's critics demanded that he prove orthodoxy by attacking Luther, and Luther's followers demanded that Erasmus declare himself for the Reformation. Erasmus had trained his whole intellect to resist such binary tyranny. The century demanded it anyway. The theological heart of the rift arrived through a subject that looks abstract until you live it: free will. Erasmus entered the arena in 1524 with De Libero Arbitrio, a diatribe that carried his typical method, cautious, textual, patristic, wary of absolute claims. He argued that Scripture contained difficult passages, that the Church's consensus mattered, and that exhortations and commandments made sense when human response carried meaning. He feared that Luther's language of necessity might make moral life collapse into fatalism, and he feared, as a teacher fears, what doctrines do to ordinary people who hunger for excuses. Luther answered in 1525 with De Servo Arbitrio, and the title already announced the change of climate: the will bound, the human being captive, grace acting alone. Luther treated Erasmus's moderation as evasion. He mocked Erasmus's reluctance to speak with total certainty where Luther felt certainty required. Their difference concerned more than one doctrine. It concerned what kind of mind Christianity demanded. Erasmus wanted a mind trained to weigh, to interpret, to tolerate ambiguity where God's mysteries exceed human grasp. Luther wanted a mind trained to cling, to confess, to submit where God speaks, even when the speech cuts the nerves. The rhetoric grew brutal. Luther praised Erasmus's Latin and then tore his argument like cloth. Erasmus, wounded by Luther's tone, answered with the bruised dignity of a man who had devoted his life to civility and then found civility treated as treason. If Mozart had his Salieri, Erasmus had his Luther. So we hear in that comparison the sorrowful comedy of creative life, how the closest rival often emerges from one's own circle, how the adversary sometimes begins as a beneficiary, how the disciple often becomes the executioner of a teacher's public image. Yet Salieri in the popular myth represents jealousy before genius, while Luther represented a different species of threat. He represented the genius that refuses the teacher's restraints and then persuades the world that restraint equals cowardice. The rift also belonged to sociology and politics, to bread and land, to princes and peasants. When the Peasants' War erupted in German lands, the air filled with burned manor houses and sermons preached as if they were weapons. Erasmus watched with horror, since he had always held that learning should soften manners and that reform should reduce violence. Luther, who had once spoken with sympathy for grievances, eventually urged princes to crush the revolt with harsh force, fearing anarchy more than bloodshed. The humanist's ideal of concord found itself mocked by the century's appetite for decisive conflict. Even where Luther's theological intention aimed at spiritual freedom, the historical motion of his revolt pulled Europe into confessional states, into wars of religion, into the partition of Christendom that none of the protagonists could fully govern. A hammer blow on a church door began sounding like an iron bell across centuries. At this point, permit me a confession in the lecturer's voice, since the subject demands it. I have always distrusted the story that paints Erasmus as a timid scholar and Luther as a heroic prophet, or the inverse story that paints Erasmus as wisdom and Luther as barbarism. Both caricatures comfort the modern reader who wants saints and villains. Real men carry mixtures that resist such childish sorting. Erasmus could cut with sarcasm. Luther could comfort with astonishing tenderness. Erasmus could compromise where conscience demanded firmness. Luther could become rigid where charity demanded patience. Their clash involved the perennial tragedy of conscience. When two men believe they serve God, they can treat each other as Satan's instrument with a calmness that terrifies me more than any battlefield. So what caused the fallout? Friendship, in their case, carried an asymmetry. Erasmus possessed the cultural capital. Luther possessed the disruptive charisma. Erasmus protected a pan-European network of patrons, printers and scholars. Luther protected a movement that gained its force from polemic, from preaching, from the willingness to break. Erasmus sought room for reform inside inherited structures. Luther sought a purified gospel even when inherited structures burned. Underneath theology lay temperament, and temperament lay under experience. Erasmus had seen how violence chews the poor first, while Luther had seen how institutional corruption can strangle a soul. One feared chaos, the other feared hypocrisy. Each fear possessed legitimacy. Each fear became an idol when it began ruling all judgment. And here I would like to pause for a second or so, and shake by saying, we all have our own Martin Luthers, meaning the close friend who undermines, contradicts, and thereby tests our achievements, touches a deeper anthropological nerve. Every serious thinker meets an antagonist who knows the vulnerable points, since intimacy grants X-ray vision. A rival stranger fights the public argument. A rival friend fights the private self-image. The friend-turned-opponent forces a reckoning, whether one's framework survives contact with a will that refuses its terms. Consider Kierkegaard, walking in Copenhagen with his collar up against the wind, carrying inside his chest an argument with Hegel that never ceased. Kierkegaard received from Hegelianism a sense of history's rational architecture. He received from his own spiritual sensitivity a refusal to let existence be digested into a system. He treated the system as a magnificent cathedral built for everyone, and then he asked where the single anxious soul would kneel inside it. His polemics against the public and against speculative philosophy sprang from a former intimacy. He had learned the dialectical music, and therefore he could hear the moments where that music sang over real suffering. He turned against what had educated him, in the way Luther turned against the church that had formed him, and in the way Luther turned against Erasmus's temperament of caution. A lineage of betrayal can carry integrity. It can also carry vanity. Each case requires discernment. The pattern repeats through literary history in more domestic clothing. I think of Nietzsche and Wagner. The young philologist intoxicated by a composer's mythic ambition, the composer delighted by a disciple's brilliance, and then the friendship souring as Nietzsche sensed in Wagner a theatrical Christianity smuggled into art, while Wagner sensed in Nietzsche a moral ferocity that refused communal pieties. Their quarrel carried Europe's larger quarrel between Dionysian liberation and cultural discipline. I think of Sartre and Camus, whose friendship burned with shared resistance and shared fame until moral judgment over revolutionary violence split them. Camus defending a measured humanism, Sartre flirting with a politics that treated terror as history's midwife. I think of Freud and Jung, where the father and the heir enacted a drama of doctrine and temperament that resembled, in psychological key, the Erasmus-Luther quarrel, who owns an interpretation, who sets boundaries for a movement, whose tone becomes law. Each of these fractures carries a theology of pride and a theology of fear. Pride, since a thinker can begin loving his own framework as if it were God's face. Fear, since a thinker can begin guarding a framework as if its collapse would mean personal annihilation. Erasmus feared that the Christian commonwealth would shatter into sects and wars, and his fear proved prophetic. Luther feared that a gospel diluted by human merit would become a spiritual marketplace, and his fear also proved prophetic. Their conflict therefore teaches a bitter lesson. Prophecy can arrive from opposed directions at once, and a century can punish both prophets by fulfilling both warnings. When I imagine the Wittenberg door, I imagine something humbler than tourist legend. I imagine a cold morning, paper stiff in hand, the smell of damp wood, the nails biting, the sound sharp enough to make a passing student glance over his shoulder. The theses, in that moment, functioned as a scholastic invitation to dispute, and yet the act carried the shape of theatre. Erasmus, across the map, had long practised a quieter theatre, a preface that flatters and then undermines, a footnote that smiles and then humiliates, a Greek variant reading that quietly discredits a preacher's proof text. Luther brought conflict into the square. Erasmus kept conflict in the study, hoping the study might civilize the square. The square conquered the study. Even so, Luther depended on Erasmus in ways the polemics tried to conceal. Erasmus's Greek New Testament and his philological labours fed the Reformation's hunger for scripture in the original tongues. Luther's translation work relied on the best tools available, and those tools bore Erasmus's fingerprints. The rival, therefore, lived inside the rival's house. That fact annoys every partisan story, Catholic and Protestant alike, since it reveals how intellectual history behaves. Enemies share furniture. Now, centuries later, we live among the consequences. Confessional identities, denominational loyalties, the modern habit of treating private conscience as an ultimate court, the political pattern of princes and states deciding religion through power, the cultural habit of polemic as entertainment. We also live among certain gifts. Scripture heard by lay ears, education widened, critique granted dignity, moral hypocrisy exposed with less fear. The inheritance carries poison and medicine mixed, like a village well after a battle. So what do I take from Erasmus and Luther, as a man who has watched friendship strain under ideology, who has seen comrades turn into prosecutors, who has watched the best minds ruin each other for the sake of purity? I take a warning against the pleasure of rupture. Rupture flatters the ego since it makes a man feel decisive. I take a warning against the fetish of moderation as well, since moderation can mask cowardice and preserve injustice with polite manners. I take a reminder that God, in Scripture, often speaks through quarrels among believers, and that the apostles themselves argued fiercely, though they also broke bread afterward, which remains the hardest commandment in intellectual life. A friend who becomes one's Luther can serve as a providential scourge. Such a friend forces the question, does the framework serve truth, or does it serve the self who built it? Erasmus faced that question when the world demanded he condemn Luther. Luther faced it when Erasmus demanded he temper certainty. Each failed, and each succeeded in different measures, which keeps their story alive. When I teach this history, I try to keep one image near: Erasmus at his desk, lamplight on the page, weighing Greek words with the tenderness of a physician, and Luther at his table, tankard nearby, voice rising in a room full of students, turning Scripture into thunder. Two kinds of love, two kinds of danger. If you want the lecture to end with a resolution, I will offer one that carries tension, since tension remains honest. The Erasmus in me longs for concord, for the slow healing of institutions, for critique that saves what it chastises. The Luther in me longs for truth that risks comfort, for speech that refuses bribery, for grace that humiliates pride. Both voices live in a single chest. When I silence either, I grow grotesque. When I allow them to speak under discipline, under prayer, under learning, under the memory of blood spilled by slogans, I approach wisdom with trembling steps. History, with its grim humour, keeps handing each generation a church door and a study desk. A friend stands beside us, close enough to smell our fear, and that friend either joins our labour or breaks our spell. The true task resembles discernment: to recognize when contradiction serves truth and when it serves vanity, to recognize when reform requires patience and when patience becomes complicity, to recognize, above all, that every great quarrel among Christians leaves widows in its wake, and every great quarrel among thinkers leaves the young hungry for something sturdier than faction. Erasmus and Luther, bound together by fate and letters, offered Europe two temptations and two graces. Their fallout became a hinge in the Western mind. Under that hinge, our own friendships creak. We lean our weight on them. The door swings. The draught enters. We keep living inside the weather they made.